think for a moment, she said, that Israel did this without America's permission, because economically Israel is too dependent on the U.S. for military aid. And in fact, fragmentation bombs made in the U.S., bombs filled with nails and small metal particles that exploded in every direction and were essentially anti-personnel weapons, were being dropped in Lebanon. In response to harsh criticism, Israel claimed the weapon was being used for defensive purposes because it had agreed only to use U.S. weapons if attacked or if its survival was threatened. Ironically, many of the Palestinians saved their sharpest enmity for the Arab governments, whom they felt showed the greatest cowardice by not facing up to Israel and not helping their own, and using the plight of the Palestinians to divert attention from their own internal problems. Their news always focused on the Zionist enemy in order to deflect the people's frustration from inequities and failures at home. The Palestinians had gotten a raw deal from everybody. And when the massacres took place at Sabra and Shatila, she said, "This is what happens to the Palestinians. This is what the Israelis have wanted to do from the beginning." When it came out that the Christian phalangists had carried out the massacre, Naim and her friends were convinced the Israelis were behind it and had masterminded it, and that Nazi Sharon was responsible. She said, "The Israelis want to do to the Palestinians what the Nazis did to the Jews." This analogy is very strong in the Arab community. And, of course, at B'nai B'rith, the propaganda line was that the Israelis had nothing to do with the massacres, that the phalangists had acted on their own without the knowledge of Israel. And he had to carry out the official line by being part of an effort to arrange interviews on shows like Nightline and Meet the Press and the nightly network news shows where spokespeople through B'nai B'rith articulated the Israeli position. And he'd videotape them, and if they expressed themselves eloquently and forcefully and held their own in debates with others, he would have copies made of the videotapes, and he'd send them out to all the B'nai B'rith offices throughout the world. And there were a lot of tapings of meetings with Israeli officials who were trying to mobilize B'nai B'rith and other Jewish organizations. But there were divisions within the Jewish community, and B'nai B'rith had some individuals who did speak out against the invasion. He even observed a demonstration of Jews against the invasion of Lebanon, marching outside the White House. And he taped Moshe Aarons, the Israeli Secretary of Defense, at the National Press Club, defending the invasion. He had a map that showed the times and places of terrorist actions against Israel. And when he was asked about the question of the creation of a Palestinian state, he said, "There already is one." And there was a moment's pause before he said, "Jordan." Jordan was, after all, an artificial state created by Britain, and in fact, 85% of the people who lived there were Palestinian. Then, one day, he came to work, and on one of the building's marble walls, painted in red, were the words, "Murderers of Children." He went into his office, and there was a memo on his desk that said, "Take a picture of the defaced wall, as part of our campaign to show that the war has brought forth anti-Semitic feelings." He didn't want to, but he did, and the picture was printed in a number of newsletters that were distributed to raise funds. The Arabs called it anti-Zionism, but the ADL considered anti-Zionism thinly disguised anti-Semitism. That was in September of 1982. He was also involved at this time in a rent strike against his landlord, who'd been raising the rent but providing inadequate services. He'd organized the tenants into an association. The landlord was Jewish, and he began to think of anti-Semitic epithets against him. That dirty Jew, that dirty Jewish slum landlord, ignoring for the moment that he was himself Jewish. He organized meetings, brought housing inspectors by, but the situation had a curious, ironic side. The landlord was letting a black woman live in her apartment for free, since her husband, the former superintendent of the building, had died, and in a building that only had 7 units, it meant that everybody else, all the other tenants, had to absorb her rent. They felt they were being exploited because they had to pay for the landlord's charity, and they didn't have washers or dryers, though he'd promised to install them. In the basement, there also lived a madman, a schizophrenic. If he didn't take his pills, he'd begin to rant and rave for days about the conspiracy between Israel and the Vatican, and you could hear him very clearly through the floor. His behavior was disturbing the people in the building, not to mention the neighborhood, because he'd stand on the sidewalk and shout at people as they passed. The place was dirty and had deteriorated since the super had died. Once his toilet got stopped up, and he couldn't get the landlord to send a plumber for 3 days. Then Naim got a job at the Computer Science Corporation, way out in Reston, Virginia, teaching Saudis English for technical training on computer systems. This involved a commute of at least an hour. She'd get up at 6:30 in the morning and didn't get home until 8:30 at night. By this time, she'd moved more of her things into his place. She had 3 suitcases there, and the closets were filled with extra clothes, including traditional red and gold embroidered long flowing Yemeni dresses, mixed in with his Charlie Brown jackets. She'd come home exhausted. She was tense and on edge, and he felt more and more drained from his job. They were making love less frequently. She wanted to make love in the morning at 5 a.m. when she had some energy, but he was always too tired. And on the weekends they couldn't go bike riding or play tennis for any length of time because of her knees. She'd have to stop in agony, and she'd become depressed. She'd been told she should have an operation to retard the degenerative process, but she'd put it off. And she began to berate him for not cleaning up the bathroom and not cleaning up after each meal and making sure there was no food left anywhere. She said he should wash his hair more often, clean his nails. He dressed like a schlub. Once she took him to White Flint Mall in Virginia to buy him new clothes because I don't want to be seen with you on the street. She hated it when he went to Union Station to get his hair cut by old Italian barbers who tell him wonderful stories about mafioso gangsters in Washington in the 40s and give him the worst haircuts in the world. She'd say they didn't know how to cut his hair. They were making him look like a jerk. But he didn't care. In Yemen, where there are large families and water tanks on the roof, you need to conserve water and you don't flush all the time. And she'd say, "Why are you flushing the toilet so often? It's such an incredible waste of water." "Well, where I come from, you don't let the urine sit," he'd tell her, remembering his father screaming at him for not flushing the toilet. "This is America, and there's no shortage of water here." Then she complained that he never brushed his hair, so she'd take a brush to it, but the way she brushed it never looked right to him. And she wasn't sleeping soundly. Sometimes she'd suddenly wake up, sit bolt upright, look at him, and start screaming, "Who are you?" staring at him as if she'd never seen him before in her life. "Who are you? What are you doing here? Who are you?" And he was shaken by it, particularly when she began shouting at him in Arabic. He grew afraid of touching her in the middle of the night because it might trigger this reaction. And then he made fun of it. He said, "You know, we've been together for over 2 years, and you still don't know who I am." But inside he felt hurt. They almost never went to American films any longer because of the violence and because Arabs were always characterized in awful stereotypes. Once they saw a trailer for Rollover, a Jane Fonda film, in the coming attraction before The Personals, the movie they'd planned to see, came on. Jane Fonda and Chris Christopherson were apparently international bankers, and the villains were shady OPEC ministers, sheiks, all wearing sunglasses. Then they went to see State of Siege. There was a scene where an American advisor trained the police of a Latin American country on how to conduct electro-torture, and you saw electrodes being attached to a man's genitalia, at which point she said, "I cannot watch this anymore," and stormed out of the theater. And he ran after her and said, "You didn't give it a chance. They were trying to make a point. I know it's horrible to see that, but maybe you'd appreciate the political content." But she was extremely upset by the violence, and he began to feel a revulsion against himself, that he wasn't as upset at these images as she was. He began to think, "My God, I am sick for not responding." And he thought her reaction was, in a way, healthier, while he was responding as someone who'd been inundated on a daily basis with violent images. Her visa ran out, so she was officially illegal, and she'd confront him with the fact that he hadn't voluntarily offered to marry her. He'd try to calm her down. "Well, I do want to marry you, and, well, let's just do it." And then she said, "You're just saying this because my situation is so bad. You don't really mean it." Then later she began to cry. "I need a home, and you're not giving me one. I guess I'll have to go and make my own. I can't stand America. I can't stand the isolation in this country." And he said, "Look, let's go to a movie." And she screamed, "I don't want to go to another movie. I can't stand going to another movie. That's all you Americans do is watch television and go to movies. You go from your apartment into a dark theater and you sit in silence and watch something for 2 hours and then you have some coffee and that's it." "Then what do you want to do?" he asked. "Do you want to go dancing?" And she said, "No, it's too smoky in those places." And then she asked, "What am I doing in this country?" That summer, his brother got married. He was reluctant to bring her to the wedding. His grandmother didn't know about her. He'd always downplayed the relationship to his parents. He'd even suggested he was becoming involved with a Jewish woman he'd met at B'nai B'rith. He told her she'd feel very uncomfortable at the wedding. "It'll just be my close relatives," he said. "We don't often get together." She seemed to accept it, so he went to the wedding alone. They had a great live band, and everybody got drunk and performed Jewish Russian dances. At one point, he left the ballroom and went to a pay phone and called Naeem. He felt bad that he was there having fun without her. She said, "It sounds like you're having a good time." And he said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, I'm going to have to spend another day here because the party is going to last too long, and I won't be able to make the flight because I probably won't get back home until 3 or 4 in the morning." And she said, "All right, I'll pick you up at the airport the next morning." And she came to the airport the next morning, helped him with his bag, seemed in a fairly happy mood, and said, "I've made a decision. I'm going back to Yemen." She was very casual, and he was shocked, but he didn't really respond. In a way, he felt relieved, and now estranged from her, as if she was no longer his lover. Maybe this was the best thing for her. And he asked her questions like, "Do you have a job? And what will you do when you get there? And are you sure you want to do this?" And she seemed very set in her mind about it. She said she talked to someone at the Yemen embassy and thought she might be able to get a job at the University of Sana'a in the capital city. "I've just got to go," she said. "Whatever happens, happens. I can't live this way any longer." Then, one night, she went out drinking with a friend to a place called F. Scott's and said she'd be back around 10 or 11, but she stumbled in at 2 in the morning, and she was violently drunk. And she ran to the bathroom and threw up, but missed the toilet, and he cleaned up after her. And then she got immersed in the details of going home, and they never talked about what it meant to them. It was like just another trip. She gave notice at work, sold her car, tried to find out what job opportunities there were at the University of Sana'a, and during that last month they had no arguments. And Naeem decided to throw one more final party back at the boarding house, a party like the one she used to throw. There was a lot of food, and people, and dancing. She seemed happy about going back home, and he felt numb. During that last year, she'd been asked to dance at the Georgetown University Auditorium at a multicultural night, and she'd choreographed a performance in honor of the Palestinians who died in Sabra and Shatila. Then she gave a recital at another student cultural night at George Washington University. He came along with her in the cab to the airport. They had a quick breakfast, and then there was an announcement that it was time to board, and they said almost nothing to each other. He walked her down the concourse to the point where the passengers have to go through the X-ray machines, and she looked at him and said, "Goodbye." They hugged. He felt tears welling up, but she seemed withdrawn. As he left the airport, he didn't think, "Well, it's over." He returned to his apartment, where she'd left many of her things. She didn't have the money to take them on the plane or to ship them, so he was surrounded by her possessions. He couldn't stand listening to any of her records. He'd take a shower, and she wasn't there to lotion. He'd cook meals alone, sleep alone. At one point, he broke down and cried because he missed her so much. Then he got a letter from her with a picture of her on an old fishing boat. She was in Kuwait visiting one of her sisters on her way home. Her next letter was from Yemen. She was very depressed. The streets were dirty. All the women had to dress with veils. Things were not working out at the University of Sana'a, but she was talking with the Yemen American Language Institute, partly funded by AID, who might need an English teacher, and she was living with her married cousin, and he had the feeling she'd eventually come back. He felt elated. It wasn't really over. dated only one person during that time, a Jewish woman named Sheila he met at B'nai B'rith. He'd drive out to her apartment in Rockville, Maryland, and try to sleep with her, but she'd resist. She said she was involved with a young man who was just coming out of law school, but he seemed serious enough that she might drop the law student for him. He never took it seriously, and he wrote Naeem constantly and told her how foolish it had been of him to think he could live without her, and how much he missed her. But he never said outright, "Let's marry." And now she had a good job at the Yemen American Language Institute and was being very well paid, because the State Department labels Yemen a hardship post, and it was a State Department contract. So under the civil service rating, you get much more money, and she was teaching 2 hours a day, making about $35,000, and not paying any taxes. She said she kept mostly to herself. She missed him very much. She didn't wear a veil because she dressed in Western clothing, and she presented herself as a black American, which he remembered was what she hated to be thought of when she was here, and he found it ironic. It was almost impossible for her to get tampons in Yemen, because under the Muslim fundamentalist influence, women were not permitted to use them. So once he bought a big jiffy bag at the post office, which he planned to send through a State Department diplomatic pouch, so it wouldn't be opened by the Yemeni authorities and confiscated or stolen. And he bought about 6 boxes of tampons, ran back to his office, shut the door, opened all the boxes at once, so there were tampons spread all over his desk, and he began stuffing the tampons into the jiffy bag. While he was doing this, his boss opened the door and looked in, and there he was with tampons all over his desk, stuffing them into the bag, and his boss was a heavy-set Jewish man who'd come from an advertising background. Nothing ever fazed him, and he just stared in at him for a second or two and said, "Right," and shut the door. And he wrote a letter to Naeem describing humorously what had happened, and she wrote back berating him for mentioning that the man was Jewish in his letter, because if the wrong person read it, it could get her and her father into trouble. During her birthday in March, he bought a birthday card for her and went to all her friends and had them sign it, and he mailed her a number of cassettes of music he thought she might like. But that package never made it there. Any time he sent her anything of value through the mail, it never got to her. Then he started to call her every 2 weeks. She didn't want to call him from the school because she assumed that AID was a CIA front, that the people working for it, helping with irrigation projects, were also working for the CIA. Also, it was enormously expensive to call out from Yemen, $100 a minute, but calling in was much cheaper. And they were very careful on the phone, and there was always an echo, and it was disorienting. Then he received a letter from her in March, in which he said she'd be returning to D.C. at the end of May. The minute he got it, he withdrew from the relationship with the woman from B'nai B'rith. They had just become lovers. He'd been working on it for 3 months, and she dropped the other boyfriend. One day she invited him for lunch and asked, "What's wrong? You've changed over a space of 24 hours. Did I do something? Tell me." But he didn't tell her anything, and he shut her out of all of his feelings. He turned her down over and over again, and finally she became embittered, and she didn't want to have anything to do with him, which made things awkward at work, because she let it be known what she felt about him. At Dulles Airport is a door that separates you from the arriving passengers, with no glass windows to look through. You can hear announcements that such and such a flight has just landed, and its passengers are being processed through immigration. There were people waiting, Iranians, Arabs, diplomatic types, and he felt out of place. Then, when he saw her, he felt elation. He'd almost forgotten what she looked like, and he was reminded of his first impression. She looked like a princess or a queen, like someone he could never be involved with. Unattainable. Beautiful. They hugged briefly. Then he got into a cab, and she put her head on his shoulder and said, "I can't believe I'm back." The cab driver was Middle Eastern, and he kept staring at him through the rearview mirror. When they first walked into the apartment, they put their bags down, got undressed, and made love. She slept for the first 48 hours because she was exhausted and was suffering jet lag. He cooked her a few meals. She'd eat and go to sleep, and her friends called to check if she'd arrived, and he said yes, and it felt good, and yet strange that she was back. She was in town for 2 months. He was still at B'nai B'rith, and Sheila called to tell him that she hadn't had her period. They'd only made love 1 time, with protection, and he thought she was trying to get back at him. He said, "Why don't you wait another week and see what happens?" and he wanted to hang up because he didn't want Naeem to know anything. They ate out at their favorite old haunts, and they went to the Mediterranean bakery and picked up foods and spices for home, and she'd brought presents for everyone, something he felt many Americans wouldn't bother to do. She brought him etchings of Yemeni architecture, a jambia, which was the traditional Yemeni sword, which he'd finally found in a remote village in a mountainous area in northern Yemen, and a traditional Yemeni gown that you put over your head. The sword meant a lot to her, but he didn't respond as enthusiastically as she apparently wanted him to. Later, she remarked on his lack of appreciation. He had no idea what it had meant to go all over Yemen to find it. Their first rupture took place when she found there was an apartment in the building next door for sale for about $60,000. She'd seen the notice on the bulletin board in the hall, and she said to him, "Let's buy it." And he said, "This is crazy. What do you mean buy a condo?" She said, "Let's at least let the agent show it to us." And he resisted in purely pragmatic terms. "What are you talking about? Do you know what the down payment is?" But she wanted to make a home for herself, and she dragged him to look at it. He said it wasn't big enough. "Why don't we look around somewhere else?" But she didn't have the time, she said. Her break lasted until the end of July, and then she'd have to go back. "So you really have to go back?" he asked. "Well, I don't know," she said. "It depends." It was obvious what she wanted, that they get married and live together, but he seemed to will not to understand. He seemed only half-conscious. It was as if his passionate letters to her had meant nothing. And he felt panic and thought, "She left? Why didn't you cut it off? Now she's back and all the problems have resurfaced." But he loved the fact she was with him. He just didn't want to make any commitment to a life together. He wanted her to stay on a day-to-day basis. And she said, "I came back and I wanted a home with you, and you're just offering resistance. I can't believe this. This is a nightmare." And he tried to placate her by answering, "Look, I don't think we should take this apartment. Why don't we look for a house? Rent a house somewhere." "No, I don't want to rent. I want my own place." And Sheila called twice more and said, "I still haven't had my period. What are you going to do about this? I'm pregnant." And once she called right after Naeem and he had made love, and they were both naked, and he carried on a conversation with Sheila in such a way that Naeem wouldn't suspect anything. He spoke extremely impersonally. "No, I can't help you," he said. "I can't help you." And he hung up. Then he said to Naeem, "Look, why don't we just get away? Maybe we should move to Canada, to Montreal or Toronto, or let's take a vacation, get out of Washington." And she said, "Good, let's do it." They both thought if they got out of D.C. and the rut they were in, to some place that refreshed them, maybe being alone, away together, they'd somehow work things out. They tossed around some ideas, and she suggested Toronto, picking up on what he'd said about living there, and he vetoed it. "No, I've been to Toronto. I don't want to go there." Then she suggested Jamaica. Now, he knew nothing about Jamaica except for the commercials on television. She'd never been to the Caribbean, and she wanted to go to a place that had an indigenous culture. So he made arrangements with a travel agency. They could stay where they wanted on the island, but they had to remain 6 days and 5 nights. So that put them in a better mood, looking forward to their trip together. This trip that might salvage the situation. After changing planes in Miami, they landed at a small rundown airport, and the first thing that greeted them as they walked through the concourse was a thin old man strumming a guitar, singing the Jamaican theme song from the TV ad. "Come back to Jamaica, what's old is what's new. We want you to join us, we're waiting for you." And there were 3 Jamaican women standing behind him, singing along with him, and it was obvious they performed the song for every single flight that landed. It was sung without energy, and they put a kind of wreath, a lei around your neck, as they do in Hawaii. And in the lobby over the public address system was the same theme, the exact same music of the commercial. And this was not what they'd hoped for. It was another ocean city. They experienced that same sinking feeling. What have we gotten ourselves into? And they stepped out into the street and were hustled by a lot of cab drivers who offered different rates into Montego Bay. Come here, I give you the best rate, only $25. They went to a hotel. All the people working there seemed to be drugged and seemed to hate their jobs. The room was small with a noisy air conditioner. And the street merchants sold incredible junk that they tried to pass off as authentic Jamaican handcrafted items, but which reflected no skill at all, or looked factory-made. lots of items made out of shells and cheap Jamaican masks. And as you walked down the main street in Montego Bay, everybody would hassle you. "Hey, you want to buy this? Come on over here, man." They'd grab your hand and pull you over, and if you didn't want to buy, they'd turn ugly and practically spit in your face. The people seemed debased by tourism. "This is what happens from colonialism," Naeem said. And there was racial tension. He could feel the Jamaican men watching them together, assuming she was a black woman, perhaps even a local. They were resolved to go home, but then Naeem pointed out that if they went back early, they'd have to pay extra because of the special deal they'd gotten, and she thought they should go to Negril, another town north. And he said, okay. So they spent the remainder of the day on the beach, but even that was ruined. He had his wallet with him and put it down with their towels and clothes on the sand, and he started to swim. It was a secluded part of the beach, and he noticed a boy approach their belongings while they were swimming, inching his way toward their clothes. So he swam back and stayed with their things for the remainder of the afternoon, and then the boy followed them at a distance back to their hotel, and finally he turned and shouted at him, "Why don't you go home?" They were at the pool of the hotel talking about how unhappy they were when a man came over and said that for a certain sum of money, $25, he would hook them up with a bus which would take them to Negril. But he was just an operator, because all he did was take them to the bus depot and buy them a ticket for a bus, though he'd made it seem it was almost impossible to do this without his help. And he told them how he'd married a black American woman who'd left him, and he was trying to save enough money to go back to the States. The bus depot was noisy and filthy. The buses were large vans that sat about 12 people. He was the only white person on board. The bus consisted of mostly large black women going back to their towns after working in Montego Bay. Someone had brought 2 live chickens along, and another had a goat, and the ride took forever because the bus stopped at every conceivable little hamlet in town. And now they were seeing the real Jamaica, which was a terribly poor country, impoverished. The road was lined with shacks and people standing idly around staring at the passing bus. Then the bus driver said, "Negril." They got off with all their bags, and there were a few small hotels along the road, but each one was filled. One had a room, but no air conditioning, and it was more expensive than the hotel in Montego Bay. So they walked with their bags in the heat of the afternoon, and it was starting to turn dark. Now every so often he had allergic reactions to a plant. He doesn't know what it is. It exists in Washington, but it started happening the last day they were at Montego.